Audrey Hepburn fell in love 5 times, married twice, and spent 63 years looking for the man who disappeared when she was 6 years old. Her father, Joseph Rustin, was a Nazi sympathizer who abandoned his family and never looked back, leaving Audrey with a question that would haunt every relationship she ever had. Why wasn't she enough to make him stay? She married Mel Ferrer, 12 years older, controlling and cold, a father figure who directed her on screen and off. Then Andrea Dotti, whose infidelities she forgave again and again, because abandonment once was unbearable, but abandonment twice might destroy her completely. Between and around them were the almost loves, the affairs, the men who saw her beauty but missed her wounds. Audrey Hepburn was the most elegant woman in Hollywood, but elegance is performance, and what she was performing was completeness, wholeness, the illusion that she didn't spend every day of her life wondering what was wrong with her, that her own father couldn't love her. She gave the world breakfast at Tiffany's and Roman holiday, and the image of effortless grace. But inside, she was still a 6-year-old girl, watching her father walk away, trying to understand what she'd done wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The first abandonment happened in 1935, when Audrey was 6 years old and still believed that fathers stayed. Joseph Victor Anthony Rustin was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who had married Ella van Heemstra, a Dutch baroness, in 1926. It seemed like a fairy tale on paper, British charm meeting continental nobility, wealth and title, and the promise of a life lived in drawing rooms and country estates. But Joseph Rustin carried secrets that would poison everything he touched. He was a fascist sympathizer, drawn to the dangerous politics sweeping across Europe in the 1930s, attending meetings of the British Union of Fascists, reading Hitler's writings with approval, believing that strength came through domination, and that certain people were simply born to rule over others. Audrey adored him. In the way daughters do, she had placed her father on a pedestal so high she had to crane her neck to see him. When Joseph smiled at her, the world was perfect. When he ignored her, the world went grey. She learned early to read his moods, to adjust her behavior to keep his attention, to be charming and quiet and good, whatever would make him look at her with approval. Her mother, Ella, was distant in the aristocratic Dutch way, all propriety and proper behavior, a woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. But her father, when he chose to notice her, could be warm. Those moments were so rare and so precious that Audrey hoarded them like treasures, replaying them in her mind, trying to understand what she'd done right so she could do it again. In 1935, Joseph Rustin left for England on what he said was a business trip. He never came back. There was no explanation adequate to a 6-year-old's understanding, no way to make a child comprehend that adults sometimes simply choose to disappear. Ella told Audrey that her father had important work to do, that he would return when he could, but children know when they're being lied to. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and Joseph Rustin remained gone. The truth, which Audrey wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that her father had abandoned his family for his politics, choosing his fascist beliefs over his wife and daughter, deciding that ideology mattered more than the little girl who waited every day for him to walk back through the door. The abandonment carved something out of Audrey that would never grow back. Where her father's love had been, there was now a question that echoed in the emptiness. What was wrong with her? If she had been prettier, smarter, quieter, louder, different somehow, would he have stayed? The logic of 6-year-olds is both simple and devastating. If your parent leaves, it must be because you weren't good enough to make them stay. Audrey would spend the rest of her life trying to be good enough, trying to be perfect enough, trying to be lovable enough that no one would ever leave her again. Her mother dealt with the abandonment by becoming even more rigid, more distant, more determined to raise Audrey according to strict aristocratic principles. Ella van Heemstra was a woman who believed that emotions were weaknesses to be controlled, that physical affection was inappropriate, that children needed discipline more than comfort. She sent Audrey to boarding schools in England, believing that proper British education would shape her into a respectable young woman. But what Audrey learned in those cold English schools was that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned, and that no matter how hard you tried, sometimes people still left you alone. In 1939, when Audrey was 10, the world gave her something larger to fear than her father's absence. World War II began, and Europe descended into chaos. Ella, terrified of what was coming and desperate to protect her daughter, made the decision to return to Holland, believing that neutral Netherlands would be safer than England. It was one of history's cruel ironies. She was taking Audrey from the country that would remain free into the country that would be occupied and starved. But Ella couldn't have known that in 1939, and she made the choice she thought would keep her daughter safe. They settled in Arnhem, a city in the eastern Netherlands near the German border. For a brief time, life attempted normalcy. Audrey attended the Arnhem Conservatory, studying ballet with a passion that bordered on obsession. Dance gave her what nothing else could, a language for the feelings she wasn't allowed to express, a physical outlet for the pain she'd been taught to hide, and most importantly, control. In ballet, if you worked hard enough, if you disciplined yourself enough, if you perfected your technique, you could be beautiful, graceful, good. Ballet didn't abandon you if you loved it hard enough. It gave back exactly what you put in. On May 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The country fell in 5 days. Audrey was 11 years old when the soldiers arrived in Arnhem, 11 years old when she learned that the world was even more dangerous than she'd imagined, 11 years old when she understood that her father's politics, the fascism he'd chosen over his family, had conquered her new home. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The men wearing swastikas, the ones her neighbors feared and hated, believed the same things her father believed. Did that make her father a monster? Did that make her, by extension, monstrous too? Her mother, despite her aristocratic aloofness, proved braver than anyone had expected. Ella van Heemstra quietly joined the Dutch resistance, using her title and connections to pass messages, hide people, coordinate escapes. She taught Audrey to be useful without being obvious. A child could carry messages in her shoes, could deliver packages while pretending to play, could dance in secret performances to raise money for the underground. Audrey learned to lie with a straight face to Nazi soldiers. She learned to smile when she was terrified. She learned that survival required performance, that you could be dying inside and appear perfectly composed on the outside. It was training she would use for the rest of her life. Ballet became resistance. Audrey danced in secret performances, the windows covered with blackout curtains. The music played so softly that guards outside wouldn't hear. She danced to raise money for the resistance, and she danced because it was the only time she felt free. Her teachers said she was good, possibly even great, that after the war she might have a real career if she kept training. Ballet became Audrey's dream, not just something she loved, but her entire future, the one thing that made the occupation bearable. If she could just survive the war, if she could just keep dancing, everything would be all right. Then came the winter of 1944, and nothing would ever be all right again. The Dutch hunger winter, they called it later, with the sanitizing distance of historical terminology. But there was nothing distant or sanitized about starvation. The Nazis, in retaliation for Dutch resistance activities and the failure of Operation Market Garden, cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands. For months, there was nothing to eat. People stripped bark from trees and boiled it into soup. They ate tulip bulbs, which made them sick, but at least filled the stomach with something. They burned furniture to stay warm. They watched neighbors collapse in the street from starvation and learned to step over bodies on the way to search for food that didn't exist. Audrey was 15 years old and growing, her body demanding. Nutrition it couldn't have. She watched herself waste away in the mirror, her cheeks hollowing, her ribs becoming visible, her hip bones jutting through her skin. She felt her muscles weakening, her stamina fading, her body slowly consuming itself to stay alive. The worst part wasn't the hunger, which was constant and gnawing and all-consuming. The worst part was watching her ballet dreams die along with her body. She couldn't dance anymore, didn't have the energy, the strength, the muscle mass. Her ankles swelled with edema. Her hair fell out. Her period stopped. Her body was shutting down, prioritizing survival over everything else. 22,000 people died in the Dutch hunger winter. Audrey survived, but survival is not the same as living. When the Allies finally liberated Holland in May 1945, when food trucks arrived and people wept at the sight of bread, Audrey's body had been so damaged by malnutrition that she would carry the effects for life. Her growth had been stunted. Her bones were weakened. Her digestive system was compromised. And her ballet dreams, the ones that had sustained her through occupation and starvation, were over. The doctors explained it gently. Her body couldn't handle the demands of professional ballet. The malnutrition had stolen that future from her. At 16, Audrey had to choose between the dream she'd held since childhood and the reality of a body that war had broken. She chose life, chose survival, chose to find another way forward. But losing ballet felt like losing herself, the one thing she'd been good at, the one thing she'd controlled, the one arena where perfection was achievable through pure effort. Without ballet, who was she? Just a girl whose father had abandoned her, whose body had betrayed her, who had nothing particular to offer the world. Her mother moved them to London in 1948, desperate for work, for opportunity, for anything that might help them rebuild. Audrey enrolled in ballet classes with Marie Rambert, still hoping that perhaps the doctors had been wrong, that perhaps she could recover enough to dance professionally. But her body told her what her heart didn't want to accept. She would never be strong enough. Ballet required a foundation of childhood training, of muscles built before puberty, of bones that had been properly nourished during critical growing years. Audrey had none of that. The war had taken it from her. So she pivoted to acting, taking small roles in West End musicals, earning barely enough to survive. She was pretty in an unconventional way. Too thin, too angular, eyes too large, eyebrows too thick. Hollywood typically preferred curves and conventional beauty, blonde bombshells like Marilyn Monroe. But there was something about Audrey, some combination of vulnerability and poise, childlike innocence mixed with knowing sadness, that made directors look twice. She could move. The ballet training gave her a grace that translated to screen, and she could perform. Emotion, while keeping perfect control, could be falling apart inside while appearing serene outside, because she'd been practicing that particular performance since she was 11 years old under Nazi occupation. In 1951, while filming a small role in Monte Carlo, Audrey met the writer Colette, who was searching for someone to play Gigi in the Broadway adaptation of her novel. Colette took one look at Audrey and knew she'd found her Gigi, a young woman who could portray innocence tinged with melancholy, who could be charming and sophisticated despite barely being out of childhood herself. The role terrified Audrey. Broadway meant American audiences, American critics, a level of exposure she'd never experienced. But she was broke and desperate, and still trying to figure out who she was after ballet. So she said yes. Gigi made Audrey a Broadway success in 1951, but more importantly, it put her in front of Hollywood directors who were looking for something different, something fresh, something that wasn't just another blonde in a sweater. William Wyler cast her in Roman Holiday opposite Gregory Peck, a role that would change everything. She played Princess Anne, a royal on an official visit to Rome who escapes her handlers for one day of freedom with a charming American reporter. The role was everything Audrey understood viscerally, a young woman trapped by expectations, performing grace and duty while desperately wanting to be seen as a real person, choosing responsibility over happiness, because that's what good girls do. Gregory Peck was 42 to Audrey's 24 when they filmed Roman Holiday in 1952. He was kind to her, protective, seeing in this nervous young actress something precious that needed safeguarding. In his kindness, Audrey saw her father, or rather, the father she'd always wanted. Peck was dignified, respected, secure in himself in ways that made Audrey feel safe. She developed feelings for him that blurred the line between romantic love and the desperate need for paternal approval. Peck, to his credit, never took advantage. He was married, committed, and besides, he recognized what Audrey was really looking for wasn't him, but something he represented. Roman Holiday premiered in 1953 and made Audrey Hepburn an instant icon. Critics praised her luminous performance, audiences fell in love with her gamine charm, and Hollywood had a new kind of star, elegant instead of sexy, sophisticated instead of girl next door, European instead of American. At 24, Audrey won the Academy Award for Best Actress, becoming one of the youngest women ever to receive the honor. She stood on that stage in a white floral Givenchy gown, looking impossibly elegant and impossibly young, and thanked everyone graciously. While inside, she wondered if this was finally enough, if being this successful, this celebrated, this loved by millions, would fill the hole her father had carved 16 years earlier. It didn't. Success never does fill those kinds of holes, but Audrey didn't know that yet. She thought if she could just be perfect enough, perfect on screen, perfect in interviews, perfect in appearance, perfect in behavior, then she would finally be lovable enough that no one would ever leave her again. She controlled everything she could control: her weight, her posture, her public image, her emotions. The elegance the world worshipped wasn't natural. It was the result of relentless self-discipline, constant vigilance, the exhausting work of making perfection look effortless. In 1954, Audrey met Mel Ferrer during the filming of Sabrina. Mel was 42 to Audrey's 25, the same age gap she'd had with Gregory Peck, and that was not coincidence. Mel was an actor and director, sophisticated and worldly, someone who spoke multiple languages and moved through elite circles with ease. He was also controlling, possessive, and deeply insecure about his own fading career. Where Audrey saw a cultured older man who could guide and protect her, others saw a manipulator who recognized vulnerability and knew how to exploit it. They married in September 1954, just months after meeting, and immediately Mel positioned himself as Audrey's director, both on and off screen. He managed her career, chose her roles, instructed her on how to perform, told her what to wear and how to behave. In some ways, Audrey welcomed it. Having someone make decisions meant she didn't have to, and she'd been taught since childhood that pleasing authority figures was how you earned love. But Mel's control came with criticism. She wasn't good enough, wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't appreciating his guidance enough. Every critique landed on the wound her father had created. She still wasn't enough. The world saw Audrey Hepburn's golden age in the 1950s. Sabrina, Funny Face, Love in the Afternoon, The Nun's Story, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Each film solidified her status as Hollywood royalty, the epitome of elegance and grace. But each film also required her to be away from Mel, which meant enduring his jealousy and suspicion. He resented her success, which had eclipsed his own. He questioned her fidelity, though he was the one having affairs. He made her feel guilty for working, then criticized her for not being ambitious enough. It was a maze with no exit, a series of double binds that kept Audrey constantly off balance, constantly trying to be better, constantly failing to satisfy someone who couldn't be satisfied. She wanted children desperately, seeing motherhood as redemption. If she could be the mother she hadn't had, give unconditional love the way her mother hadn't, maybe she could heal the wounds her childhood had inflicted. But pregnancy was difficult for her damaged body. She suffered multiple miscarriages, each one another failure, another way she wasn't good enough. The doctors said her malnutrition during the war had affected her reproductive system, that her body simply couldn't sustain pregnancies easily. Even her womb, it seemed, carried the scars of abandonment and starvation. In 1960, Audrey finally carried a pregnancy to term, giving birth to Sean Hepburn Ferrer. The joy was profound, but so was the terror. What if she couldn't be a good mother? What if she abandoned him the way her father had abandoned her? What if her own coldness, inherited from Ella, made her incapable of the warmth her son would need? She threw herself into motherhood with the same perfectionistic intensity she brought to everything, trying to be the perfect mother, because perfect mothers didn't fail their children, didn't leave them, didn't create wounds that would last a lifetime. But perfectionism is exhausting, and Audrey was already exhausted from years of performing in her marriage. Mel's control had intensified after Sean's birth. Now he had opinions about how she should mother, what she was doing wrong, how she was spoiling the boy or being too strict or not following his guidance. She couldn't win. She had married Mel looking for a father figure who would guide and approve, and instead she'd found someone who used her need for approval as a weapon, who kept moving the goalposts so she could never quite reach them. The 1960s brought more iconic films, Charade with Cary Grant, My Fair Lady, though Audrey's singing was dubbed, another thing Mel criticized, How to Steal a Million. But they also brought the slow dissolution of her marriage. Mel's career had stalled while hers soared, and his resentment became poisonous. He criticized her publicly, humiliated her at parties, made cutting remarks disguised as humor. And still, Audrey tried to make it work, because leaving meant admitting failure, meant abandoning ship the way her father had abandoned her, and she couldn't become what she'd hated most. By 1968, after 14 years of marriage, Audrey finally had enough. She filed for divorce from Mel Ferrer, and the relief was immediate and profound. She thought freedom would feel like victory, but mostly it felt like confirmation. See, you weren't good enough to make it work. If you had been better, he wouldn't have treated you that way. If you had been enough, he would have loved you properly. The voices in her head sounded like her father's absence, and Mel's criticism blended into one endless loop of inadequacy. She retreated to Switzerland, bought a farmhouse in the countryside, tried to build a life that was just hers and Sean's, without men directing her every move. But loneliness is a poor companion, and Audrey had never learned to be alone without feeling abandoned. When she met Andrea Dotti in 1968, an Italian psychiatrist 9 years her junior, she thought perhaps the pattern would be different this time. Andrea was younger, not a father figure but a peer. He was charming, passionate, Mediterranean in his emotions, everything Mel hadn't been. She fell in love fast and hard, the way people do when they're trying to prove the last. Relationship was an aberration, not a pattern. They married in 1969, and Audrey gave birth to their son Luca in 1970. For a brief time, she believed she'd found it, the family she'd always wanted, the love that would finally satisfy the hunger her father had created. She stepped away from acting almost entirely, choosing motherhood and marriage over career, convinced that this time she would get it right. But Andrea was never going to be faithful. Italian men of his class, his generation, his disposition, they collected affairs the way other men collected ties. He loved Audrey, certainly, but he also loved other women, frequently, carelessly, with barely any attempt at discretion. Each affair was a knife in the old wound. Each time Audrey discovered another woman, she had to choose. leave and be abandoned again, or stay and accept betrayal as the price of not being alone. She chose to stay, again and again, forgiving infidelities that destroyed her self-respect, because the alternative, another failed marriage, more confirmation that she was unlovable, was unbearable. Friends watched in anguish as Audrey Hepburn, the most elegant woman in the world, accepted treatment that no one deserved, stayed in a marriage that was slowly poisoning her, all because leaving felt like dying. She tried to make herself smaller, more perfect, more accepting. She lost more weight, which on her already tiny frame meant she looked skeletal. She controlled her eating with frightening discipline. Not quite anorexia, but close, the kind of restriction that gave her power over the one thing she could control when everything else felt chaotic. If she couldn't control Andrea's fidelity, she could at least control her body. If she couldn't make him love only her, she could at least be so thin, so perfect, so desireless herself, that maybe he'd feel guilty. It didn't work. It never works. By 1980, after 12 years of marriage, Audrey finally left Andrea Dotti. 2 divorces felt like defeat, like proof that she was fundamentally unlovable, that her father had been right to leave, that there was something wrong with her that made her impossible to stay with. But she was also 51 years old and tired of performing, tired of trying to earn love from men who were constitutionally incapable of giving it, tired of making herself smaller to accommodate egos that were already too large. She thought she might be done with men entirely, might focus on her sons and her garden and the quiet life she was building in Switzerland. But then she met Robert Wolders, a Dutch actor whose wife had recently died. Robert was kind in ways the other men hadn't been. He didn't try to control her, didn't criticize her, didn't need her to be anything other than herself. They never married. Audrey had had enough of legal bonds, but they built a partnership that was, finally, built on mutual respect rather than need and power. Robert gave Audrey something she'd never had before: companionship, without conditions. He admired her but didn't worship her, which meant she could relax around him, could be imperfect, without fear of abandonment. He encouraged her when UNICEF approached her about becoming a goodwill ambassador, recognizing that Audrey needed purpose beyond being an icon. And when cancer came for her in her final year, Robert held her hand and told her she was enough, had always been enough, would die enough even if she'd never quite believed it. The UNICEF work was Audrey's redemption and her reckoning. Starting in 1988, she traveled to the world's most desperate places: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, Somalia, holding starving children who reminded her of herself at 15, skeletal and haunted. She understood these children in ways that glamorous Hollywood celebrities typically couldn't. She had been them. She knew what it felt like to be hungry, to watch your body waste away, to wonder if anyone in the world cared whether you lived or died. When she held those children, she was holding her younger self, trying to give them what no one had given her during the hunger winter: the assurance that they were seen, that they mattered, that someone would fight for them. The work exhausted her, the travel, the heat, the emotional toll of witnessing such suffering. But it also gave her life meaning in ways that acting never had. Acting had been about being looked at, about performance and perfection. UNICEF was about looking, about witnessing, about using her fame for something beyond her own career. She discovered that she could take the brokenness her father and her mother and the war and Hollywood had created in her and transform it into compassion. The wounds didn't heal, but at least they could be useful. In 1992, Audrey began experiencing terrible stomach pains. She ignored them for months, too busy with UNICEF work, too accustomed to pushing through discomfort. By the time she saw a doctor, the cancer had already spread throughout her abdomen. Colon cancer, advanced and aggressive. The surgery removed what it could, but the prognosis was grim. She had months, not years. She spent her final months in the farmhouse in Switzerland, surrounded by her sons and Robert. The cancer stole her appetite, and her body returned to the skeletal state of her teenage years during the hunger winter. Skin stretched over bones, eyes too large in a gaunt face. It was as if her life was coming full circle, beginning and ending with starvation. But this time, at least, she wasn't alone. Her sons were there, and Robert was there, and they told her they loved her not for her elegance, or her films, or her beauty, but just for being herself, which was something Audrey had never quite believed anyone could do. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died at her home in Tolochenaz, Switzerland. She was 63 years old. Her sons were with her. Robert Walters held her hand. She died as gracefully as she'd lived, which is to say with tremendous effort, made to look effortless, with pain hidden behind a serene expression, with the performance continuing until the very last moment. Her father, Joseph Ruston, who had abandoned her in 1935 and reappeared occasionally throughout her life to ask for money, which she gave him, unable to stop trying to buy his love, had died in 1980. He never apologized for leaving. He never acknowledged the damage his abandonment had caused. He took interviews about his famous daughter and made it sound like he'd been a present, loving father, rewriting history to cast himself in a better light. Audrey never publicly contradicted him. Even in death, she was protecting him, unable to admit that her father had been cruel, because admitting that would mean acknowledging that his cruelty had shaped her entire life. The world mourned Audrey Hepburn as an icon of elegance and grace. Presidents and prime ministers issued statements. Her films played on television in tribute. Fashion magazines published retrospectives of her style influence. UNICEF established programs in her name. The funeral in Switzerland was private, attended only by family and close friends, but thousands of people lined the streets, throwing flowers at her hearse, desperate to say goodbye to someone who had represented something important to them. But what did Audrey Hepburn represent? Ask 100 people, and you'll get 100 answers. Elegance, grace, sophistication, humanitarian compassion, timeless beauty, classic style, European refinement. All of those things are true, and all of them miss the essential truth. Audrey Hepburn was a woman who spent 63 years trying to earn love from a father who had abandoned her when she was 6, and who transferred that need onto every man she encountered, searching in their approval for what her father had never given her. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked: older men, controlling men, father figures who could guide and protect and approve. Mel Ferrer was her father. Andrea Dotti was her father. Even in her relationships with directors, Billy Wilder, William Wyler, Blake Edwards, she sought paternal approval, becoming the perfect actress who never caused trouble, who always hit her marks, who performed exactly as directed. She made it easy to love her professionally, which meant no one had to love her personally, which reinforced the belief that she was only valuable for what she could do, not who she was. Her sons, Sean and Luca, inherited her beauty and her wounds. They speak of her now with love and pain intertwined, describing a mother who was present and absent simultaneously, who loved them fiercely but couldn't quite believe they loved her back, who worried constantly about being a good mother because her own mother had been so cold. They describe coming home to find her crying in private. The elegant public persona collapsed in the privacy of her home. They describe her anxiety, her perfectionism, her inability to accept compliments or believe in her own worth. They describe, in other words, a woman whose childhood wounds never healed, who carried the pain of abandonment for 63 years, who died still wondering if she'd ever been enough. The elegance that made Audrey Hepburn iconic wasn't a gift. It was armor, carefully constructed over decades to hide the wounded girl underneath. Every perfect outfit was a performance of control. Every graceful gesture was learned behavior, ballet training applied to life itself. Every poised interview was a carefully maintained facade designed to hide the chaos inside. She made it look effortless, but effort was all it was, constant, exhausting, relentless effort to be perfect enough that no one would see how damaged she felt, how convinced she was that if people saw the real her, they would leave just like her father had left. The humanitarian work with UNICEF was the closest Audrey came to healing, but even that was complicated. Was she helping starving children because she was genuinely moved by their suffering, or was she trying to save her younger self over and over, trying to go back in time and rescue the 15-year-old girl who ate tulip bulbs during the hunger winter while no one came to help? Probably both, probably all of it. Human motivation is rarely pure, and Audrey was nothing if not human, despite Hollywood's best efforts to turn her into a goddess. The truth about Audrey Hepburn is that she was profoundly, achingly ordinary in her pain, even as she was extraordinary in her beauty and talent. She wanted what everyone wants, to be loved unconditionally, to be seen for who she really is, to feel safe and valuable and enough. Her father denied her that, and she spent the rest of her life trying to get it from men who couldn't give it, because you can't fill a father-shaped hole with romance or sex or marriage or even humanitarian work. Some wounds don't heal, they just become part of who you are, shaping your choices, informing your relationships, echoing in the empty spaces until you die. In Breakfast at Tiffany's, Audrey played Holly Golightly, a young woman running from her past, from poverty and pain, creating a sophisticated persona to hide the scared girl underneath. When Holly stands outside Tiffany's in the film's opening, eating a croissant and gazing at diamond necklaces she can't afford, she's performing wealth and security she doesn't possess. The role was pure autobiography. Audrey understood Holly's performance viscerally because she'd been performing her entire life. The only difference was that Holly eventually admits to the performance and chooses authenticity. Audrey never quite managed that. She performed until the very end, graceful and elegant, and perfectly composed even as she was dying. Her relationship with food was another arena where childhood trauma played out. The starvation of the hunger winter made food complicated. It was survival, but it was also scarcity, trauma, loss of control. Throughout her adult life, Audrey ate with extreme discipline, keeping her weight preternaturally low, exercising control over her appetite in ways that suggested unresolved eating issues. She was never diagnosed with an eating disorder, but the behaviors were there: food restriction, obsessive portion control, guilt around eating, using hunger as a form of self-punishment or control. When you've starved involuntarily, choosing to starve voluntarily gives you back power. It's dysfunctional power, but it's power nonetheless. The men Audrey loved saw what they wanted to see. Mel saw a beautiful actress he could mold and control. Andrea saw an icon whose fame reflected well on him. Robert, finally, saw a person, flawed and wounded and real. That he came so late in her life feels like one of the universe's cruel jokes. If she'd met Robert first, if she'd had 50 years with someone who loved her without needing to control or possess her, would her life have been different? Would she have been able to heal the father wound? Or was that wound simply too deep, carved too early, too foundational to her personality to ever fully address? The question is unanswerable, but it matters. Because the story of Audrey Hepburn isn't just about one woman's pain. It's about how childhood trauma shapes everything that follows, how parental abandonment creates patterns that repeat until addressed, how beauty and success and humanitarian work and everyone's love can't fill the hole created by the one person whose love you needed most. Audrey Hepburn had millions of people who adored her, but she died still trying to earn her father's approval, still wondering if she'd ever been enough for the man who left when she was 6. That's the tragedy. Not that she died of cancer at 63, though that's sad enough. The tragedy is that she lived 63 years and never quite believed she was lovable, never quite trusted that people wouldn't leave, never quite felt secure in herself. The elegance was performance. The grace was armor. The humanitarian work was redemption she didn't need, because the sin hadn't been hers. It had been her father's, but she carried the guilt anyway, because that's what children do when parents abandon them. They internalize the rejection, make it mean something about their own worth, spend their lives trying to prove they were worth keeping. On Audrey's grave in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, there's a simple marker with her name and dates and a quote she loved. For beautiful eyes, look for the good in others. For beautiful lips, speak only words of kindness. And for poise, walk with the knowledge that you are never alone. It's lovely and aspirational, the kind of quote people put on inspirational posters. But the last part, walk with the knowledge that you are never alone, reads differently when you know Audrey's story. She was never physically alone in her adult life, always surrounded by people. But loneliness isn't about, presence or absence of bodies. It's about feeling fundamentally disconnected, convinced that no one truly sees you, that if they did see you, they'd leave like your father left. Audrey Hepburn walked through life feeling profoundly alone despite the crowds, despite the husbands and sons and friends and millions of fans. That loneliness started when her father walked out the door in 1935 and never quite ended. Not even when Robert Wolders held her hand as she died. Not even when her sons told her they loved her. Not even when the whole world mourned her passing. Some abandonments echo forever, and no amount of elegance or success or love from other people can quite make the echo stop. The world wanted an icon, a symbol of grace and sophistication, and Audrey gave them one. She performed it flawlessly for decades, made it look effortless, never let them see how much it cost her. But the cost was high, a lifetime of trying to be perfect enough, lovable enough, good enough to make her father come back, to make men stay, to prove she had value beyond her utility and beauty. She paid that cost until the day she died, and even in death, the performance continues. We remember Audrey Hepburn as perfect, elegant, graceful, not as the wounded girl who spent 63 years trying to understand why her father didn't love her enough to stay. That girl deserved better. She deserved a father who stayed, a mother who was warm, a childhood unmarred by war and starvation, relationships with men who loved her without needing to control her. She deserved to believe she was enough just as she was, without the performance, without the perfection, without the constant striving. But life rarely gives us what we deserve, and Audrey Hepburn's life gave her fame and beauty and humanitarian purpose, but not the one thing she needed most, the unshakable knowledge that she was lovable, not for what she could do or how she appeared, but simply for being herself. In the end, Audrey Hepburn's greatest performance wasn't on screen. It was the 63-year performance of being someone who had it together, someone who wasn't still bleeding from childhood wounds, someone who had moved past her father's abandonment. She made the world believe it, which is testimony to her skill as an actress. But the people closest to her knew the truth, that underneath the Givenchy gowns and the perfect posture and the gracious smile was a little girl who never stopped waiting for her father to come home, who never stopped wondering what she'd done wrong, who never quite believed that anyone could love her without conditions. That little girl was still there when Audrey died, 6 years old, watching her father walk away, trying to understand, trying to be good enough to make him turn around. She waited 63 years for him to turn around. He never did. And that, finally, is the story. Not of elegance or grace or humanitarian compassion, but of a wound that wouldn't heal, a question that had no answer, a father who left, and the daughter who spent her entire life trying to understand why she hadn't been enough to make him stay. The world lost an icon when Audrey Hepburn died. But what the world never quite understood was that the icon was a construct, beautiful and hollow, designed to hide the human underneath. The human was wounded and scared and desperate for love, just like everyone else. She just hid it better. She made it look like grace. And perhaps that's its own kind of triumph. Not healing, but at least making beauty out of brokenness, making performance out of pain, giving the world something lovely to look at, even while you're dying inside. It's not the triumph anyone would choose, but sometimes it's the only triumph available. And Audrey Hepburn took it, wore it like one of her Givenchy gowns, and made it look effortless until the day she died.